I've always believed in the quiet strength of routine. My name is Daniel, and for 12 years, my life with Claire has been a steady rhythm. Waking up to the hum of our coffee maker, her soft laughter at my terrible jokes, the way she'd curl into me on the couch after a long day. She's a graphic designer, freelancing from our cozy home in Portland, while I manage a small bookstore downtown. We built something solid, or so I thought. The cracks started small, almost invisible. It was late October, the air crisp with falling leaves, when I noticed her phone buzzing more than usual. She'd glance at it, smile faintly, and tuck it away. "Just a client," she'd say, her hazel eyes flickering with something I couldn't place. I trusted her. Why wouldn't I? She'd never given me a reason not to. But then came the late nights. She'd stay up, hunched over her laptop, claiming deadlines were piling up. I'd offer to make tea, and she'd wave me off with a distracted, "I'm fine, Dan, go to bed." Her voice was warm, but her focus was elsewhere. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint clack of her keyboard, or was it her texting? I couldn't tell anymore. One night, I padded downstairs for water and saw her silhouette against the glow of her screen. She didn't hear me approach. Her fingers danced across her phone, not her laptop, and that smile, the one I thought was mine, played on her lips. My stomach twisted, but I said nothing. I told myself I was paranoid, that 12 years of marriage couldn't unravel over a hunch. The next clue came at breakfast. She was humming, flipping pancakes, when her phone chirped. She grabbed it faster than I'd ever seen, her face lighting up as she typed a reply. "Who's that?" I asked, casual as I could manage. "Oh, just Mia," she said, naming her old college friend. But Mia's texts never made her blush like that. I watched her flip the pancake, the spatula trembling slightly in her hand. Something was off, and it gnawed at me. That evening, I did something I'd never done before. I checked her laptop while she showered. The browser history was clean, too clean, like she'd scrubbed it. But her cloud storage was still syncing. And there it was, a folder labeled Inspiration. Inside were photos, not of art, but of her. Smiling, posing, radiant. And in one, a man's arm draped around her waist. My chest tightened. I didn't recognize him, but I knew he wasn't me. I couldn't breathe right for days. That photo haunted me. The stranger's arm, casual and possessive, wrapped around Claire like he belonged there. I didn't confront her. Not yet. I needed proof, something concrete to hold up against the life I thought we had. I started paying attention, really watching her. She'd leave the house more often, saying she needed fresh air or a coffee run. She'd come back with no coffee, her hair slightly mussed, her cheeks flushed. I'd ask how her walk was, and she'd ramble about the weather, avoiding my eyes. It was like living with a ghost of the woman I married. I decided to follow her. It was a Thursday, gray and damp, when she announced she was meeting me at a cafe downtown. I called in sick to the bookstore, pulled on a hoodie, and trailed her from a distance. She didn't go to the cafe. Instead, she turned down a side street, her steps quick and purposeful, until she reached a sleek black car parked near the park. A man stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and a grin that made my fists clench. She threw her arms around him, and they lingered there, pressed close, before slipping into the car. I stood frozen, rain soaking through my clothes, as the windows fogged up. I didn't need to see more. I knew. His name was Ryan. I found it out later that night, digging through her phone while she slept. She'd left it unlocked by mistake. A rare slip. The texts were a punch to the gut. "Can't stop thinking about you," he wrote. "You make me feel alive," she replied. There were dates, times, places. A hotel downtown. A cabin up the coast. My hands shook as I scrolled, each message a blade twisting deeper. They'd been meeting for months, maybe longer. She'd lied to my face, smiled at me over dinner, while planning her next escape with him. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the dark, staring at her sleeping form, wondering how I'd been so blind. The betrayal wasn't just the act. It was the intimacy of it. Claire wasn't sneaking off for something quick and meaningless. She was building a whole other life with Ryan, one where I didn't exist. I found more evidence over the next week. A receipt for lingerie I'd never seen, tucked in her purse. A playlist on her phone titled R. Slow, romantic songs we'd never listened to together. She'd even started wearing a new perfume, sharp and floral, that clung to her like a signature I didn't recognize. Every detail was a reminder that she'd chosen him, that I was the leftover piece she hadn't bothered to discard. I started planning. Not confrontation, revenge. I wanted her to feel what I felt, to lose something she couldn't replace. But first, I needed to know who Ryan was. I searched his name online, cross-referencing the bits I'd gleaned from her texts. Ryan Kessler, 38, a photographer with a studio in Seattle. His Instagram was full of artsy shots, landscapes, cityscapes, and then, buried in the grid, a photo of Claire. She was laughing, wind in her hair, captioned simply, "Muse." My blood boiled. He'd posted her for the world to see, while I was still playing the fool at home. I drove to Seattle the next weekend, telling Claire I had a book convention. She barely looked up from her laptop, murmuring, "Have fun." The studio was a loft in an industrial part of town, all exposed brick and pretentious vibes. I watched from across the street as he worked, directing a model with the same easy charm he'd used on my wife. He was good-looking. I'd give him that confident, magnetic. It made sense why she'd fallen for him. But that didn't soften the rage building inside me. I snapped photos of him, his car, his building. I didn't know how I'd use them yet, but I knew they'd matter. Back home, I played the part of the oblivious husband. Claire noticed nothing, too wrapped up in her secret world to see the storm brewing. I cooked dinner, asked about her day, even kissed her goodnight. She'd smile, oblivious, while I memorized every lie she told. It was a strange kind of power, knowing more than she thought I did. But it wasn't enough. I wanted her to suffer, and I wanted Ryan to pay too. The idea hit me one night as I stared at the ceiling, her soft breathing beside me. It wasn't enough to expose them. I needed something bigger, something that would unravel their lives like they'd unraveled mine. I started with Ryan. He was the key, arrogant, public, vulnerable in ways Claire wasn't. I dug deeper into his life. He had a fiancée, a woman named Elise, who lived in Seattle. Her social media was a shrine to their relationship. Engagement photos, gushing captions about my forever. She had no idea about Claire. I almost felt sorry for her, but then I saw an opportunity. If Ryan's world collapsed, Claire's would too. I created a fake email account and sent Elise an anonymous message. Ask Ryan about the woman he's been seeing in Portland. Check his phone. I attached one of the photos from Claire's cloud, the one with his arm around her. It was a gamble, but I didn't care. 2 days later, Claire came home rattled. She tried to hide it, but I saw the tension in her shoulders, the way she kept checking her phone. "Everything okay?" I asked, feigning concern. "Yeah, just a rough day," she muttered. I didn't push. That night, she got a call and stepped outside to take it. I listened through the cracked window as she hissed, "What do you mean? She knows? How did this happen?" Ryan's voice was faint, panicked. I smiled to myself. The first domino had fallen. Elise didn't waste time. By the next morning, Ryan's Instagram was a war zone. Angry comments from Elise's friends, cryptic posts from her about betrayal and liars. Claire was a mess, pacing the kitchen, muttering about misunderstandings. She told me she had to go to Seattle to help a friend. But I knew the truth. I let her go, waving her off with a cheerful, "Drive safe." As soon as her car disappeared, I got to work. Revenge wasn't just about Ryan anymore. It was about Claire, about making her feel the weight of what she'd done. I started with her clients. She'd built a solid reputation as a designer, freelancing for small businesses and artists. I knew her email password. She'd used the same one for years. I logged in and drafted messages from her account, polite but firm, canceling every contract she had. "Due to personal circumstances, I can no longer fulfill my obligations," they read. I hit send on a dozen emails, watching her career crumble with each click. She'd find out soon enough, and she'd have no one to blame but herself, or so she'd think. Next, I turned to her precious memories with Ryan. She'd saved every photo, every text, in that inspiration folder. I uploaded them to a public drive, then posted the link on a local Portland forum under a throwaway account. Found these on a lost phone. Who's this couple? I wrote. It wouldn't take long for someone to recognize her. She'd always been active in the community. People knew her face. The humiliation would hit. Oh my gosh, this is terrible. I clicked around and found out some people think Portland is the best place for cheating on your spouse. Can you believe that? I kept clicking around on the forum, just to see what's up, and found some folks talking about how easy it is to sneak around there, because everyone's so laid back and all about living your truth. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. By the time Claire got back from Seattle, the whispers would have started. I could already imagine her face. Pale, confused, then horrified as her perfect little world fell apart. And I wasn't done yet. Claire came back from Seattle late Sunday night, her eyes red-rimmed and her hair a tangled mess. She barely looked at me as she dropped her bag by the door and mumbled something about being exhausted. Rough trip, I asked, keeping my voice light. She nodded, avoiding my gaze, and shuffled upstairs. I didn't follow. I didn't need to. The seeds I'd planted were already sprouting. I could feel it in the air, thick with her unspoken panic. She thought she could still control this, that she could patch things up with Ryan and keep me in the dark. She had no idea how deep the hole was getting. Monday morning, the first wave hit. Her phone started buzzing nonstop while we ate breakfast. Silent, tense, the clink of forks on plates the only sound. She glanced at it, frowned, and silenced it. Then it buzzed again, and again. Busy day, I said, sipping my coffee. Yeah, something's up with a client, she replied, her voice tight. I smiled into my mug. She excused herself to take a call in the other room, and I listened as her tone shifted from confusion to dread. What do you mean, canceled? All of them? She hissed. I knew what she was hearing, her clients, one by one, dropping her like a bad habit. My emails had done their job. By noon, she was a wreck, pacing the living room, muttering about miscommunications. She didn't suspect me, not yet. She was too busy trying to salvage her career, emailing apologies, begging for second chances. I watched from the kitchen, pretending to read a book, while the second wave crept closer. The forum post had taken off overnight. Someone had recognized her in the photos. Isn't that Claire from the art fair? And the thread exploded. Locals loved a scandal, and this one was juicy. The sweet designer with a secret lover, all laid bare in blurry snapshots. I refreshed the page on my laptop, hidden behind my novel, as the comments piled up. Her poor husband, one wrote. What a snake, said another. I almost laughed. Claire didn't leave the house all day. She stayed glued to her laptop, typing furiously, her face pale as she scrolled through what I assumed were client rejections, or maybe the forum. I didn't ask. I kept busy, whistling as I cleaned the kitchen, acting like nothing was wrong. She barely noticed, lost in her unraveling world. That evening, her phone rang again. Ryan's name flashed on the screen before she snatched it up and darted outside. I cracked the window just enough to hear. Elise is gone, he said, his voice ragged. She trashed my studio, Claire. Everything's ruined. Claire's response was sharp. You said you'd handle it. How did she even find out? I smirked. They were turning on each other already. She came back inside, shoulders slumped, and collapsed onto the couch. Bad news, I asked, all innocence. Just friend drama, she muttered. I nodded, letting her stew. The next morning, she got the real blow. Our neighbor, Mrs. Hargrove, stopped by with a plate of cookies and a look that could curdle milk. Claire, dear, she said, her tone dripping with pity. I saw something online. Are you okay? Claire froze, stammering. What are you talking about? Mrs. Hargrove patted her hand. Oh, honey, everyone's talking about it. Those pictures? She trailed off. glancing at me with a mix of sympathy and suspicion. Claire's face went white. She bolted upstairs, slamming the bedroom door, while I thanked Mrs. Hargrove and shut the front door with a quiet thrill. I found her later, hunched over her laptop, the forum thread open. She didn't hear me come in. The screen glowed with her shame. Photos of her and Ryan. Her lies exposed. Her name dragged through the mud. She clicked refresh, and a new comment popped up. Her husband must be devastated. What kind of woman does this? She buried her face in her hands, a choked sob escaping. I stood there, silent, letting it sink in. She still didn't know I was the architect of this chaos. That was the best part. The fallout spread like wildfire. By Wednesday, Claire's phone was a graveyard. Clients gone, friends silent. Even her sister texted a curt, "Call me when you figure this out." She tried to play it off, telling me over dinner that she was taking a break from work due to stress. I nodded, cutting my steak, letting her dig herself deeper. "Sounds rough," I said. "Anything I can do?" She shook her head, eyes darting away. She was crumbling, and I hadn't even played my trump card yet. The public humiliation was just the appetizer. Ryan was next, and through him, I'd tighten the noose around her. I drove to Seattle again that night, leaving Claire curled up on the couch with a glass of wine she didn't deserve. Ryan's studio was a mess. Shattered lights, torn canvases, Elisa's rage etched into every corner. He was there, alone, sweeping up glass with a defeated slump. I didn't approach him. Not yet. Instead, I slipped into a nearby bar and struck up a conversation with a guy who knew him, a chatty regular named Pete. "Ryan's screwed," Pete said, nursing a beer. "Elise didn't just leave. She took half his clients with her. She's got connections." I bought Pete another round, coaxing out details. Ryan's business was hanging by a thread, and I intended to cut it. Back home, I found Ryan's client list online. Photographers aren't exactly discreet about their gigs. Using another fake email, I sent a mass message to every name I could find. Beware of Ryan Kessler. Unprofessional, unreliable, and involved in personal scandals. See attached. I included a screenshot of the forum thread, Claire's face front and center. It wouldn't take much. His reputation was already shaky after Elisa's exit. I hit send and leaned back, imagining his phone lighting up with cancellations. Claire would feel it too, the ripple effect of her lover's collapse. She tied herself to him, and now they'd sink together. Claire started unraveling faster than I'd expected. Thursday morning, she got a call that made her drop her coffee mug. Ceramic shards scattered across the floor as she whispered, "No, no, no." I cleaned it up while she paced, arguing with someone. "Ryan, I assumed." "How could this happen?" she kept saying. "We were careful." I suppressed a grin. Careful didn't matter when I was pulling the strings. She hung up, staring at the wall, then turned to me with a forced smile. "Just a mix-up," she said. "Nothing big." I nodded, playing along. She didn't know I'd already burned her bridges and was now torching his. That afternoon, she left the house again. Probably to meet him. I didn't follow. I had other plans. I called our landlord, an old friend named Greg, and told him we'd need to break the lease. "Claire's got some personal stuff going on," I said vaguely. "We might need to move." Greg was sympathetic, promising to waive the penalty. I thanked him, then started packing my things, not hers. She could figure that out later. I rented a storage unit across town and moved my books, clothes, and keepsakes in one trip. The house felt emptier without my presence anchoring it, and I wanted her to feel that void. When she got back, she didn't notice at first. She was too distracted, ranting about people overreacting to the forum mess. "It'll blow over," she said, more to herself than me. I shrugged. "Maybe." That night, I slept in the guest room, claiming I had a headache. She didn't protest. The next morning, she found my empty closet and froze. "Dan, where's your stuff?" she asked, voice trembling. "Just reorganizing." I lied smoothly. "Don't worry about it." Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't push. She was too busy drowning in her own chaos to see mine closing in. Friday was the tipping point. Claire woke up to an email from Greg. Our lease was officially ending in 30 days. What's this? She demanded, shoving her phone in my face. I glanced at it, feigning surprise. Oh yeah, I talked to him. Thought we could use a fresh start. Her jaw dropped. A fresh start? Dan, what are you talking about? I met her gaze, calm as ever. Things have been off lately, haven't they? Maybe a change would do us good. She stared at me, searching for cracks in my story, but I gave her nothing. She stormed off, muttering about fixing this mess. Meanwhile, Ryan's world was imploding. My email had worked, his clients were dropping him left and right, and a quick check online showed his studio's Google reviews tanking with one-star rants about untrustworthy service. I'd heard through Pete that he was scrambling to sell equipment just to pay rent. Claire's phone buzzed with his pleas, and she'd step outside to argue, her voice rising with desperation. We can't just give up, she'd snap. I watched from the window, sipping tea, as her life with him crumbled. She still didn't see my hand in it, but she would soon. That evening, I left her a note. Gone to the bookstore. Back late. Instead, I met with a lawyer downtown. I'd been gathering evidence, screenshots, receipts, timestamps. I wanted out clean, and I wanted her to have nothing. The lawyer, a sharp woman named Karen, smirked as I laid it all out. She won't know what hit her, Karen said, drafting papers. I nodded. Claire had betrayed me with Ryan, but the real betrayal was coming from me now, and it would be merciless. Saturday morning, Claire was a shadow of herself. She shuffled around the house in a daze, her phone silent for once. No clients, no Ryan, no one. The lease email had shaken her, but she still hadn't pieced it together. I kept up the act, humming as I made breakfast, asking if she wanted toast. She barely answered, staring at her laptop like it might save her. It wouldn't. I'd already moved the next piece into place. Karen had finalized the divorce papers overnight. Irreconcilable differences, no alimony, no shared assets. I'd been careful with our finances, keeping my bookstore earnings separate. She'd have nothing to fight with. Around noon, the mail arrived. I timed it perfectly. Among the bills was a thick envelope from a friend in Seattle, postmarked days ago, addressed to Claire. Inside were printed screenshots of her texts with Ryan, the forum thread, and a handwritten note. Thought you should know what your wife's been up to. I'd forged it to look like Elisa's doing. A parting shot from Ryan's ex. Claire tore it open, her hands shaking, and as she read, her face crumpled. Dan, she whispered, turning to me. Did you see this? I glanced over, frowning. What's that? She hesitated, then shoved it back in the envelope. Nothing, just junk. But her eyes betrayed her. She knew the walls were closing in. That afternoon, I left for work again, but I went to the storage unit instead. I sorted through our shared life, photos, trinkets, her old sketchbooks, and pulled out everything that mattered to me. The rest I piled into boxes labeled Donate. Her art supplies, her favorite mugs, the scarf she'd knitted me years ago, all destined for strangers. I wanted her to come home to an empty shell, a house stripped of meaning. On my way back, I stopped by the bookstore and told my assistant manager, Jen, I'd be taking some time off. Family stuff, I said. She nodded, no questions asked. Everything was falling into place. Claire confronted me that night. She waited until I was in the living room, flipping through a novel before she snapped. Dan, what's going on? The lease, your stuff missing. What are you doing? Her voice cracked, a mix of fear and anger. I set the book down, meeting her gaze. I told you, Claire. A fresh start. She stepped closer, hands on her hips. Don't play dumb. This isn't you. Did you know? She didn't say Ryan's name, but it hung there, heavy. I tilted my head, letting the silence stretch. Know what? Her breath hitched, and she backed off, muttering, Forget it. She didn't want the truth, not yet. Sunday, I upped the stakes. I'd found Ryan's car listed for sale online. He was desperate, unloading assets to survive. I called the number using a burner phone and posed as a buyer. Meet me in Portland, I said, naming a lot near the river. He agreed, his voice strained. I didn't show up. Instead, I tipped off a towing company about an abandoned vehicle, giving them his plate number. By Monday, I heard through Pete that Ryan's car was impounded. Another blow to his crumbling life. Claire got the call that morning. She didn't hide it this time. He's stuck here, she said, pacing. Everything's falling apart. I shrugged. Sounds tough. Then came the house. I'd arranged for a moving crew to come while Claire was out running errands. Probably meeting Ryan. They packed up her things, not mine, and hauled them to a donation center across town. I left a few essentials, her laptop, some clothes, so she wouldn't suspect until it was too late. When she got back, the living room was bare. She stopped dead, staring at the empty space where our couch used to be. Dan? She called, voice trembling. I stepped out from the kitchen, calm as ever. Redecorating, I said. Her eyes widened, but she didn't argue. She was too broken to fight. Monday night, I served the divorce papers. Claire was in the kitchen, picking at a sandwich when I slid them across the table. What's this? She asked, frowning. Read it, I said, leaning back in my chair. She opened the envelope, and as the words sank in, her hands shook. Divorce? Dan, why? Her voice was small, pleading. I didn't flinch. You know why. She stared at me, searching for the husband she thought she knew, but he was gone. Is this about the rumors? The forum? I can explain. I cut her off. Don't. Just sign. She didn't. She shoved the papers away and stormed upstairs, slamming the door. I left them there, a ticking clock. Tuesday, the whispers hit our street. Mrs. Hargrove had spread the word. Claire's scandal was neighborhood gossip now. People stared when she stepped outside, their pitying looks cutting deeper than insults. She stopped leaving the house altogether, hiding behind drawn curtains. Ryan called nonstop, but she ignored him. Her lifeline was fraying. I kept busy, finalizing my move. I'd rented a small apartment downtown, a fresh slate. The bookstore was thriving without me, and I had enough saved to start over. Claire had nothing, no job, no friends, no home once the lease ran out. I checked on Ryan one last time. His studio was shuttered, his online presence dead. Pete said he'd left Seattle, tail between his legs, after losing everything. I'd crushed him without ever meeting him, and Claire felt every bruise. That night, she tried again. Dan, please, she said, tears streaming. We can fix this. I looked at her, really looked, and saw a stranger. There's nothing left to fix, I said, and walked away. She signed the papers the next morning, her hand trembling as she scrawled her name. It was done. The final blow came quietly. Claire had nowhere to go. Her career was ash, her savings drained from months of reckless spending with Ryan. I'd made sure of that, quietly siphoning our joint account into a new one she couldn't touch. She didn't notice until it was too late. Wednesday, I packed the last of my things while she watched, silent, from the stairs. Where am I supposed to go? She asked, voice hollow. Not my problem, I replied, zipping my bag. She didn't argue. She'd run out of fight. I left her the house keys, not out of kindness, but because I'd already told Greg she'd be staying until the lease ended. Let her figure out the rent she couldn't pay. I moved into my apartment that night, a clean space with no trace of her. The next day, I heard from Jen that Claire had shown up at the bookstore, looking for me. She was a mess, Jen said. Kept saying she needed to talk. I told Jen to send her away if she came back. I was done playing savior. A week later, I got a package, Claire's wedding ring, mailed with no note. I tossed it in a drawer, unbothered. She'd moved out, Greg said, leaving the house trashed. Empty wine bottles, scattered papers, a life abandoned. Someone saw her at a bus station, heading south, maybe to her sister's. I didn't care. Ryan surfaced briefly online, begging for freelance gigs, but no one bit. They were both ghosts now, hollowed out by their choices and my hands. I'd taken everything. Her stability, his pride, their future. Felt right. Months passed, and I settled into my new life. The bookstore hummed along, my apartment became a refuge, and I started dating again, casual, no strings. Claire and Ryan were echoes, fading with each day. Then, one rainy afternoon, I saw her name on a local blog. She tried to reboot her design career in Eugene, but the scandal followed her. Clients wouldn't touch her. The post was brutal, calling her Portland's cautionary tale. I skimmed it, felt nothing, and closed the tab. Ryan fared worse. Pete texted me a photo, him busking on a Seattle street, guitar case open for coins. His charm was gone, replaced by a gaunt, desperate stare. I didn't reply. They'd betrayed me, built something behind my back, and I dismantled it piece by piece. Not with confrontation or violence, but with precision, emails, whispers, calculated moves that left them with less than nothing. Claire lost her home, her work, her dignity. Ryan lost his fiancée, his business, his identity. I lost a wife, but gained a clarity I hadn't known I needed. Looking back, the revenge wasn't just about them, it was for me. I'd been blind, trusting, a fool who thought love was enough. Now I'm not that man. I sit in my quiet apartment, rain tapping the windows, and feel a strange peace. They'll never recover, not fully, and I don't have to see it to know it's true. I sip my coffee, turn the page of my book, and move on. The story's over and I wrote the ending.